Well, if I could go back, hypothetically, if I could go back in time during the ministry of Jesus' life, knowing what I know now, I would attempt to warn the apostles to brace themselves every time Jesus puts them in a boat. Every time the apostles are directed by Jesus to get in a boat, and specifically it's on the Sea of Galilee, every time he says get in a boat, there is a big lesson as a result of a storm that's going to prop up that is about to unfold. Now, when you say the Sea of Galilee, if you were to look at the map of Israel, the Sea of Galilee is really more like a lake. We have seas in the Great Lakes. We have the Great Lakes, which dwarfs the Sea of Galilee. We've got a picture, I think, of Julie and I on the Sea of Galilee. And there we are. We've been married now 42 years. That was at our 35th anniversary. And that was the actual boat that Jesus got on when no, it wasn't. It wasn't. That'd be cool if it was. There is a buoy in the back, but that is the actual Sea of Galilee. It's not that big. It's a lake, but it's incredibly deep. And the way the terrain is constructed around the Sea of Galilee, winds can change direction very quickly. And as a result of winds changing direction, storms can come up quickly. I want to give you a couple of examples where Jesus kind of says, hey guys, let's get in the boat. And you want to kind of cry out to him, guys, be careful. So the first example I have comes from Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. Jesus has been teaching some parables, and there's a large crowd that's gathered around him. And so Jesus, wanting to leave the multitudes, and he wants to just kind of go with his disciples. He wants to get alone with them. And so he suggests, hey guys, let's get in the boat and we'll go to the other side. And you just want to cry out as you're reading this. You want to go, guys, be careful, keep your eyes open. A lesson is coming. And then all of a sudden, a fierce wind picks up. Waves start breaking over this little dinghy. And Jesus is asleep. And Jesus, who knows all, the Son of God, is God in the flesh. I think he's playing possum in the front of the boat. And the disciples begin to panic. They lose hope. And at this point, they have one thing in mind, and one thing in mind only, and that is to live through the storm. At that point, nothing really matters but living. And one of the disciples even yells at Jesus, don't you care that we are about to die? I think he might have been a little dramatic. Jesus stands up. He says two things. First of all, he speaks to the wind. He speaks to the wind. He rebukes the wind. And all of a sudden, the wind just stops blowing. Then Jesus speaks to the water. He's standing up. He speaks to the water and he says, shh, hush. And all of a sudden, the water became perfectly calm. And one disciple said to another in the back of the boat, he says, in astonishment at what had just happened. Full-blown storm, and then all of a sudden Jesus goes, stop, and it stops. And one of the disciples says to another in the back of the boat, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? You can just see their wheels turning. They don't know the full extent of what they've got themselves into. Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? And they realize, what have we got ourselves into? Now, when you are around Jesus, you kind of ought to have a heads up. Don't get in the water if you don't want to experience the storm. Another example comes just 2 chapters later in the book of Mark. It's chapter 6, verses 45 through 52. Jesus had just fed the 5,000. You remember that. It was one of those landmark events. He had fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Julie and I go through half a loaf of sourdough bread in 3 days. And again, Jesus suggests, all of a sudden he goes, let's go to the other side. Let's get in a boat and go to the other side. And then he adds this caveat. He says, you guys go ahead and get in and I'll join you later. And you're kind of like, oh no, here it comes. You guys are setting yourself up again. And nobody's thinking, well, wait a minute, we're getting in the boat and going to the other side. How's he going to join us? What boat is he going to get in? And then you want to just scream out, did any of you guys sense what's coming? At that point, Jesus goes to the top of Mount Arbel. It's kind of this place, it looks over the Sea of Galilee. And sure enough, wind picks up, and it says the disciples, as they were rowing, were straining and were going nowhere. They become afraid. They're fearful for good reason. And at that moment, nothing else matters but survival. Then get this. Jesus walks up to them on the water through the storm. He is within striking distance of this ship. He gets close to the boat and he says, take courage, I'm here. Obviously. And then he says, don't be afraid. And as soon as Jesus steps into the boat, the wind stops again. And the disciples have yet to realize the one who they are following has the capacity that goes well beyond stopping the rage of a storm. Now, in both of these squallors, the disciples got to a place of being hopeless. See, hopelessness is that condition where you realize there's no way out. You, in and of yourself, have no power to overcome conditions that surpass your abilities. That's hopelessness. And sometimes, get this, I would argue that Jesus even steers us into the storms to bring us to a place of hopelessness. What? Why in the world would Jesus orchestrate steering us into a storm so that we could experience a storm? And I want you to hear me very clearly. So that in the midst of the storm, we will dump the cargo that we have been trusting in, and we will start trusting the only one that can deliver us out of the storm. This morning, we're going to see how Jesus uses storms to bring us to the exact place we need to be. And that is a place where we are totally dependent on Jesus. If you're just joining us, we've been doing a study through the book of Acts. And in the first 26 chapters of the book of Acts, Paul has completed 3 missionary journeys. As a result of these journeys, the world has been turned upside down because the power of Jesus is working in the lives of Jesus' followers all over the world. The fact that Jesus died, he was buried, and he rose from the grave is impacting all of the world. It's impacting politics. It's making a mark on education. It's changing philosophy. It's making an impact on the field of medicine, obviously on the family, on commerce, on crime. And Paul has now returned to Israel, and the Jewish leaders want Paul killed. Why in the world do they want Paul killed? For the simple reason that Paul is the tip of the spear for the spread of the gospel. Most recently, Paul has been held in a Roman prison in Israel over the past 2 years. And at the end of chapter 26, Paul was able to make a defense against the accusations that had been made against him. As a result of Paul's defense, those who were sitting in judgment over Paul could find no reason to end his life or give him any additional prison time. But because Paul requested an audience with Caesar, the emperor of Rome, the Roman officials were bound by law to send Paul from Caesarea, which is on the coast of Rome, which is on the coast of Israel, all the way to Rome. Bound by law to send him from Israel to Rome. It's 1,920 miles by sea. They would have to walk or travel on land an additional 200 miles. And that's where we find ourselves as we start in chapter 27 of the book of Acts. Now, the first 8 verses tell about his initial travels, and so I don't want to read all 8 verses. What I want to do is I want to show you a map. And so if we have this map of where Paul is going to be going, you see he starts off way down here on the lower right-hand corner of your map, this place called Caesarea. It's on the coast of Israel. And so first, Paul, and he's got this armed guard with him to make sure that he gets all the way from Israel to Rome. So they first sail from Caesarea to Sidon, which is just up the coast of Israel. From there, they go from Sidon to Myra, past Cyprus. From Myra, they go to Cnidus. About that time, they change ships. They go from a small vessel, now they get on a ship that is an Egyptian ship with lots of goods of grain on this ship, and they're going to go from Cnidus all the way to Rome. And so they go from there to Salmon, which is east side of the island of Crete. From Salmon, they go to Fair Havens, and there our story lands in Fair Havens. It's on the Isle of Crete. It's on the southern part of the Isle of Crete. And now we pick up our story in verses 9 and 10. I'm reading from the New American Standard Version, and it says this: When considerable time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them. In verse 10, and he said to them, Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo in the ship, but also could cost us our own lives. So what's going on here? He talks about a fast in verse 9. Believers fasted around the 1st of October. And the reason they fasted during that time, it was a celebration of a Jewish holiday called the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement was where believers in Jesus celebrated that sins are forgiven, which it was ultimately fulfilled when Jesus died on the cross for their sins. They're in this place called Fair Haven. It's on the southern part of this island of Crete. Fair Haven was a great place in the summer, but it was a horrible place in the winter. They find themselves on an Egyptian merchant ship headed for Rome. The ship has precious cargo. It is grain to be sold to Rome. Paul is just a prisoner. He's just a passenger with a Roman officer to make sure that Paul gets to Rome. Paul is not anywhere near the top priority of an Egyptian captain. The cargo was the top priority of this Egyptian captain. The valuable grain was the cargo that was of top value. Now, you need to understand some context. If you were traveling in the Mediterranean Sea from October to November, the Mediterranean Sea voyages got a little dicey because the wind and the waves made travel extremely difficult. But once December hit, December through February, travel was next to impossible. And so the Apostle Paul begins to implore the ship authorities, this is not, fellas, the time to travel. That's why in verse 10, Paul warns them, if they choose to continue, they could lose the cargo, but more importantly, we could lose all our lives. And this was not Paul prophesying about what will happen. This was just simple wisdom that Paul had acquired from years of travel on ships throughout the region. We know from the book of 2 Corinthians that Paul had traveled extensively on his missionary journeys throughout the Mediterranean Sea. And in fact, he had experienced 3 previous shipwrecks. So when he advises the ship captain that you guys, you might not want to sail during this time, this was simply wise advice that Paul was sharing with the ship's authorities. Paul was not looking to get out of going to Rome. Paul wanted to go to Rome. He wanted to proclaim the gospel to Caesar, the emperor of Rome. So the question at this point is, well, would this Egyptian ship's leadership heed the advice of Paul or not? You think about it. You've been inundated with wise advice, and every time you get wise advice, you have the choice. Are you going to heed that wise advice, or are you going to go, you're going to shun it away? I mean, think about it. All of us, our whole lives, we've been given wise advice. Make sure your wood pile is stacked high and heavy as you enter into winter. Make sure the tread on your tires is good as you're on a long trip. Save more than you spend. Clean living leads to a long life. Stay out of debt. Let interest work for you, not against you. Build a foundation on rock, not sand. Now, all of that's wise input. Well, let me show you what decision the ship's leadership chose, even though they were warned about the dangers. In verse 11 and 12, it says, "But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul." In other words, they weren't listening to Paul. Verse 12, "Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there. If somehow they could reach Phoenix," well, Phoenix was on the western side of the island of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, "and we could spend the winter there." So let's do some diagnostics. What's going on here? Well, rather than heed the advice of Paul, those responsible for the decision chose to sail in the face of danger. Verse 12, Fair Havens was on the southern part of the island, and it was vulnerable to be shut down for the entire winter once winter came about. And the thinking was, if we don't get out of Fair Havens now, well, we won't have a choice once winter comes. So the ship's captain was thinking, if we can reach Phoenix on the other side of the island, well, that harbor is less vulnerable. So I want you to understand something. The biggest factor in their decision-making process was moving the valuable cargo west. That was the most important factor. If they are going to make a profit, they have got to get the cargo through. The lives of the 276 sailors, well, that becomes secondary. We know it's 276 sailors because later in verse 37 it tells us how many exactly are on the ship. It's 276 sailors. Their life is secondary. The cargo is top priority. Paul's life is secondary. The cargo is top priority. Now let me show you what happens. Verses 13 and 16, the wind picks up and the travel gets dicey. Look at verse 13. "When a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore." Everything's going fine. They're moving west. And then in verse 14, "But before very long, there rushed down from the land a violent wind." And this violent wind even had a name. It was called Euraquilo. It's a combination of two words, which meant basically east by northeast. It was a wind that had a reputation, and still today has the reputation of causing typhoon-like conditions. So all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they're sailing west, and this Euraquilo catches hold of them. And then in verse 15, when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. They're out of control. This storm is taking them where the storm wants to take them. Verse 16, "Running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control." So what's going on here? Well, the wind turned violent. It was even a wind that had this name, Euraquilo. For generations, the wind brought a fear to sailors. Sailing, remaining in control was useless. All you could do is drop what was known as a kind of a storm anchor. It was like a parachute in the water that would slow down their drift. But it was really pretty useless. If you were caught in a Euraquilo, you were at the mercy of the current. There was nothing you could do. The storm would take you where the storm wanted you to go. Now, these ships, these Egyptian ships, were about 130, 140 feet long and about 35 feet wide. They are in comparison a canoe next to modern day ocean liners. An ocean liner today is about 1,000 feet long and about 120 feet wide. And so they can maneuver during these Euraquilo type storms. But this ship was only 140 feet long, about 35 feet wide. It was just basically a canoe that's just getting tossed to and fro. And now the storm is at the controls of this boat. We pick it up in verses 17 and 19. It reveals what the sailors were forced to do. Verse 17, it says, after they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables to undergird the ship. In fact, they tried to take these cables underneath the ship to try to hold the ship together from splintering. Fearing that they might run aground to the shallows of Syrtis. The shallows of Syrtis are on the north part of the coast of Africa. The shores of Syrtis were known as kind of a graveyard for ships in storms. In verse 18, and the next day, as they were being violently storm-tossed, they are in a washing machine. They have no control. And so what the sailors do, they jettison the cargo. That cargo that a few days earlier was of such value, they start throwing the cargo overboard. It makes the ship more maneuverable. And then in verse 19, on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. All the tools gone. In the midst of this washing machine, they were on a one-way course to disaster. You remember when they were in Fair Havens, their decision that drove them was profit. Because profit was what was of most value. Getting the cargo through was of more value than human lives. But now, because of the desperateness of the situation, it caused all this valuable cargo to be seen as expendable garbage. At that point, all 276 sailors, all they cared about was live through this thing. And Paul had to be thinking, you guys should have valued life more than cargo when you made your initial decision to set sail when we were back in Fair Havens. Then it happened. I want you to observe verse 20. Hopelessness sets in. Verse 20, since neither sun, now think about this. They're on this ship. Neither sun nor stars appeared. They can't see the sun. They can't navigate by the stars at night. And this was going on for many days. And it says, no small storm was assailing us. This was a hurricuelo. From then on, all hope of being saved was gradually abandoned. The storm was so fierce, you couldn't navigate by the stars. You didn't know where the sun was rising or setting. For a sailor, you're now anticipating that you are going to collide with something. And these sailors realize they're in a buzzsaw of a storm, and the idea of being saved, well, that's been removed by hopelessness. I want to propose something to you this morning. When you get to that stage of hopelessness, I think it's one of the best days of your life. Let me mount my argument. We all, if you're over 40, have experienced the hopelessness that storms bring. And I think storms come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, don't they? They come from a diagnosis that wasn't necessarily welcome, maybe a lost job, a lost investment, a premature death of a loved one, maybe bankruptcy, divorce, an affair, maybe slander at your expense. You get the idea. All of us have experienced some sort of storm that comes in some form of life-altering news. And you have to ask the question, why does God allow us to go through the storm? Is it some sort of cosmic mistake? No, when you reach a hopeless state, it is not near as bad as you think it is. See, God knows when you are thrown into that washing machine storm, you will start dumping the cargo that you originally thought would bring you life. And in the throes of the storm, you realize you'll never find life in dead things. Now, I want to show you to see how God intervenes when you lose hope in the depths of the storm. Look at verse 21 and 22. Now, when they had gone a long time without food, we know that it's approximately they've been floating around for 14 days. For 14 days, they can't see the sky. They have no idea. They think they're going west, but they have no idea what's in front of them. And then Paul stands up in their midst and says, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and this loss. Verse 22, yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship. Wow, wait a minute. Paul was a secondary citizen. Nobody really cared of the 276 on that ship who Paul even was. And what's really interesting is when a ship is on a one-way crash course, we have to ask the question, who becomes the captain of the ship? Who's the captain of the ship when the storm hits? Well, the answer to that is the ones who lead are the ones with the inside scoop on hope. See, the ones who have the perspective and wisdom and insight are the ones who steer us to hope. I have this kind of post-it note on my desk, and it says this word, anticipate. Why do I have the word anticipate? Well, I can't detangle the web that makes up people's problems, but I can get people to anticipate the intervention of the one that stands outside of our perceived terminal circumstances. And Paul, the one who was originally secondary cargo, becomes the most valued voice on the ship because he had the inside scoop on hope. Now I want you to observe how Paul directs the crew to the one that even the wind and the waves obey. It's in verse 23 through 26. Verse 23, he says, for this very night an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me. So Paul's telling everybody on the ship, guys, an angel visited me. Saying, first of all, he said, don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. In other words, I promise you, none of these guys are going to die. Verse 25, therefore keep up your courage, men, for I believe God. Probably the most important three little words in that whole paragraph. I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. Verse 26, but we must run aground on a certain island. We're going to crash, but you guys are going to live. You and I know from context where he's headed is this island called Malta. See, in the midst of the storm, we think our hope all of a sudden becomes, we're in the storm where all we're hoping is, I just can't wait for the storm to be over. That's what we place our hope in. But that's not where God wants us to place our hope. Is that the storm would be over? Because you know what's going to happen when the storm's over? You know what's on the heels of that storm? Is another storm. And so you go, I just want the storm to be over. Well, that's not your deliverance. Your deliverance is the person of Jesus, because then when the storm comes and you are buoyed to Jesus, the storm doesn't have the final say. Jesus has the final say. See, your hope is not that the storm's over. Your hope is in Jesus because he can get you through the storm. Now, I want you to understand something. Doubt, when we hit the storm, when the bottom of life falls out, doubt is a natural mole that raises its ugly head from time to time in our journey. And God knows that. So God doesn't leave us stranded when we get caught up in our doubts. For Paul, in that storm, somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea, they don't even know where they are. They're in this washing machine. They just think, well, I think we're traveling west. God sends an angel to communicate truth and courage. Remember his first words out of his mouth. Stop with this being afraid business. The second thing he says to him, hey, Paul, let me remind you, I've told you all along that you're going to have an audience with Caesar, the emperor of Rome. So either I'm good on my word or I'm not. So the first thing he says is stop with this afraidy pants business and understand what I've already promised you. I've already promised you you're going to have an audience with Caesar, so that means you're going to get through the storm somehow. And then the third thing was that the angel conveys is some new knowledge. He said, by the way, all 276 on board with you, they get through without a scratch. In fact, we'll see next week, it says they get through without being a hair on their head being harmed. So as a result of the courage that the angel passes on to Paul, Paul can now confidently implore the sailors, hey guys, be of courage. Now let me show you how this is going to flesh out, because we know that when you know an event's outcome, you can exercise confidence through the perceived danger. And you're sitting here going, well, that's just really great. We know the Apostle Paul, he gets an angel. But what about me? How does God reassure me in the midst of the storm? Well, thank you for asking, Mr. Whiny Pants. Because I want you to think about the truth that God has given you in the midst of your storms. And that's the truth that he gives you is in his holy writ, called the Word of God, called the Bible. And I can share with you a few examples. Psalm 139, where it says, he knows when we're born, he knows when we end. His thoughts towards us outnumber the sand. Another passage, Jesus says, I'll never leave you or forsake you. Peter reminds us as he's writing a letter, he says, God has a place in heaven for you that's reserved. It's yours, believer. We know from Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, nothing happens to a follower of Jesus without God's permission for it to happen. Jesus himself says, hey, you know what? I've prepared a place for you. In my Father's house are many rooms. See, either Jesus is who he says he is or he's not. Either Jesus promises stuff that comes true or he's not Jesus. In Revelation 21, he says, I'm going to wipe away every tear. This is a thimble full of the promises that God has given us. The scriptures are packed with them. See, the truth of God's words are what we cling to when all around everything gives way. In the midst of life's tragedies that pull us to the bottom, the cross of Christ is the only thing that floats. And the cross is our flotation device when we find ourselves sinking. So the question is, well, why does God allow the storm? So we will throw the cargo overboard that we think has life in it. And then what we find is God carries us to that place stripped of all human resources except our ultimate resource, which is Jesus himself. Jesus is the resource. He is the solid rock, the fixated point in the midst of the storm. And before the storm came, we were trusting in cargo, figuratively. All the things we thought we need to get from one side of the life to the other. And then all of a sudden in the storm, we realize that cargo is not doing me a bit of pleasure. It's not doing me any favors. And then all of a sudden we realize when the storm hits, what we really need is him, Jesus. As we have gone through this in the book of Acts, I give you a contemplative question while we're passing out the offering. And at this time, I'd like to ask our ushers if they would to pass out the offering as it goes by. And this is what I want you to ask. And see, I really honestly feel like what you contemplate during this time is more important than the money you put in. I didn't say I didn't want money in the offering. But I really believe that what you contemplate as a result of what we've been talking to is of more long-term value for you than what you place in that plate. And the question that I want you to examine is, what is your figurative cargo that you value more than you should? And if you were to enter into a storm, what's the cargo that you would immediately go, I got to throw that stuff overboard? Because you realize Jesus is the only thing that's getting me through this storm. So just contemplate as the plates are being passed, and then I want to bring you to a closing song that I think intersects with what we've been talking about.